Before this story continues, please allow me to make one thing clear. The story you are about to hear is a work of fiction created for entertainment and educational purposes, reflecting toxic family conflicts and the inner journey of a woman who endured in silence for far too long. All characters, events, and situations are entirely fictional and do not refer to any real individuals or real cases. The content may be supported by AI tools during the creative process. This story does not promote violence, hatred, or harm of any kind. It is told to invite empathy, reflection, and personal growth, especially for women who have sacrificed, endured, and been wounded within their own families. The entire narrative is designed to be advertiser-friendly and compliant with YouTube community guidelines, with no intent to target, defame, or imply any real person. If you recognize a piece of your own life somewhere in this story, I invite you to stay until the end. And if something here reaches you, consider sharing your thoughts in the comments, or following the channel to continue with stories for women who have been overlooked but never undeserving of dignity. My name is Kala. I am 26 years old, and I live in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, where I work in compliance and operations for a mid-sized transportation payments company. I am the person who reads the fine print everyone else skips. I track processes, timelines, and signatures for a living, which means I have spent years watching how small procedural choices quietly decide very big outcomes. My mother, Linda, is 52, polished, careful with her words, and deeply invested in the image of a respectable family. My father, Gary, is 55, practical, spreadsheet-minded, and allergic to confrontation. He prefers phrases like, "Let us not make this bigger than it needs to be." My older brother, Evan, is 29, confident, charming, and always one bad decision away from the next explanation. He is what people politely call potential. What they really mean is forgiven. And then there is Marissa, a woman in her 40s who works at a title office in Plano. She is not a friend. She is a professional contact I met through work, someone who knows how paperwork moves when no one is watching. My family does not scream or throw things. They do not fight in the dramatic ways people imagine when they hear the word toxic. They smile, they nod, and they sign documents when you are not in the room. Late September of 2023, we were in Sedona, Arizona. Red Rock views, outdoor dining, the kind of vacation my mother likes because it photographs well and feels calm enough to prove that we are a close family. The weather was perfect in that deliberate way people describe as healing. Evan was telling a story about a new opportunity, something vague and ambitious that involved a partner and a timeline he could not quite define. My father listened with the same expression he always wears when Evan talks, half hope, half denial. My mother laughed at the right moments and kept refilling everyone's glasses. I remember thinking that this was the first time in a long while that no one needed anything from me. I sat there watching the sunset hit the rocks, thinking how strange it felt to be included without being consulted. My phone buzzed in my hand just as the server placed dessert on the table. The screen lit up with a message I did not expect. "Fly home now." There was no name attached, no greeting, just that sentence. For a second I assumed it was spam or a mistake, some automated alert gone wrong. Then my phone vibrated again before I could lock the screen. "Signing is at 9 a.m. Your name is coming off the record." I did not gasp or drop my phone. I did not say anything at all. I stared at the screen while my family continued talking around me, my mother complimenting the dessert, my brother joking about how vacations should be mandatory twice a year. In that moment, everything slowed down in a way I recognized. This was not panic. This was clarity. The kind that arrives when your body understands something your mind has been avoiding. They did not forget to include me. They timed this for when I could not respond. The message was from Marissa. I knew that before I even checked the contact details. She does not exaggerate. She does not add emotion. When she says a signature is scheduled, it is scheduled. When she says a name is coming off a record, it means someone has already prepared the paperwork. I excused myself from the table and walked a few steps away, pretending to take a call. The patio lights hummed above me. I read the messages again, slower this time. Signing at 9 a.m. Tomorrow. Texas time. I was in Arizona. There was no mention of a discussion, no request for consent. Just a timeline. I looked back at the table. My mother did not look up. My father was nodding along to something Evan had said. No one noticed I had stepped away. That part hurt more than the message itself. I understood immediately what was happening, a family property in Frisco, something we had always referred to as an investment, something I had put money into years ago because it made sense and because I trusted them. And now, while we were eating dessert under a perfect sky, they were finalizing a plan that required me to be unreachable. That was the real reason for the trip, not togetherness, distance. I did not confront them. I did not demand answers. I finished my dessert. I smiled when my mother asked if I liked it. I listened while my brother talked about the future as if it were something that kept happening to him, instead of something shaped by his choices. Inside, I made a decision that surprised even me. I was not going to argue. I was not going to beg. I was not going to play the role they expected, the reasonable daughter who absorbs inconvenience for the sake of peace. I was going to do the one thing that makes plans like this fall apart. I was going to show up prepared. If you have ever been told you are fine as a way to move you aside, if you have ever realized too late that decisions about your life were made when you were not in the room, you already know this feeling. The moment when you understand that silence was never neutral. It was permission. I paid attention for the rest of the night, to the way my mother avoided details, to the way my father checked his watch when Evan mentioned deadlines, to the way everyone seemed unusually relaxed. They thought the hardest part was over. They thought distance was enough. I went to bed early that night with my phone face down on the nightstand. I did not sleep much. Somewhere between the dark and the quiet, I accepted a simple truth. This was not about money. This was about control. And I knew exactly how to take it back. If you have ever been treated as invisible in your own family, leave a key in the comments and stay with me, because the plan they made while I was away was about to collapse under its own paperwork. I learned very early what it meant to be the child who did not require discussion. Some of my earliest memories in Plano are not dramatic moments, but quiet ones, the kind that do not look harmful until you stack them together. Dinner at our house followed a predictable pattern. My mother, Linda, liked the table set just right. Plates aligned, voices kept calm. My father, Gary, believed that a peaceful meal meant a successful family. Evan always sat across from them talking about school or some idea he had picked up that week. I usually waited until there was a pause before speaking. One night when I was about 12, I brought my report card to the table. Straight A's. A small academic award clipped to the corner. I placed it between the salt and pepper like it was something fragile. My mother glanced at it, smiled briefly, then turned to Evan and asked if he had talked to his coach yet. I remember sitting there watching the condensation from my glass slide down onto the table, telling myself it was fine. It was always fine. That word became my role. Linda used to say it with a tone that sounded kind but landed heavy. You are always fine, Kala. That is why we do not worry about you. At first I thought it was a compliment. As I got older, I realized it was an explanation. Fine meant quiet. Fine meant adaptable. Fine meant not needing to be consulted. When Evan struggled with classes, there were meetings with teachers. When Evan switched majors, there were long discussions about passion and potential. When Evan needed money for a new idea, there were spreadsheets and late-night conversations. When I did well, the response was efficient. Good job. We knew you would handle it. You are not as sensitive as your brother. That one was said often, usually when I reacted to something unfair. Linda would tilt her head slightly and say it like reassurance. You are not sensitive like Evan. You can take things. Gary would nod along and add that Evan just needed a push. Evan only needs one break. That sentence floated through our house for years, excusing every missed responsibility. Meanwhile, my responsibilities accumulated quietly. I learned to clean without being asked. I learned to keep track of dates and documents because no one else wanted to. I learned to listen more than I spoke. The toxic part was never loud. It lived in the way decisions happened without me. When my parents switched insurance providers, Evan knew before the paperwork arrived. When they refinanced the house, Evan sat in on the discussion because he was thinking about real estate someday. I found out later, usually in passing, usually after everything was decided. It was presented as efficiency. We did not think you needed to be involved. You are busy. You are fine. Each time it happened, something in me tightened, not enough to protest, enough to remember. By the time I was in college, the pattern was set. Evan was consulted. I was informed. There is a difference between the two that people like to pretend does not matter. It matters when money enters the conversation. It matters when signatures are required. It matters when ownership shifts. At first, it was small things. Evan had opinions about repairs on the rental property in Frisco. Evan suggested timing for upgrades. Evan discussed potential renters. I was copied on emails after decisions were made. I told myself it was practical. I lived in the Dallas-Fort Worth area for work, but I was often busy. Evan was around more. That was the logic. That logic slowly expanded. One evening, Gary mentioned casually that they had talked with Evan about adjusting the mortgage terms. I asked why I had not been included. He looked surprised, not defensive. We did not think it was necessary. It was just a conversation. Linda chimed in quickly, smoothing the moment. You always understand these things, Kala. That was her way of ending it. You always understand. Translation. You will not make a scene. The backhanded compliments sharpened over time. You are so independent. You do not need us like Evan does. You are better at handling stress. You do not take things personally. Each phrase positioned me as the logical sacrifice. When Evan failed, it was temporary. When I succeeded, it was expected. The escalation happened quietly but steadily. From being overlooked in conversations to being excluded from minor decisions to financial ones. The first time I realized money was being discussed without me, it felt like a betrayal I could not quite name. I had contributed to that property. I had skipped things I wanted so I could wire my portion of the down payment years ago. At the time, it felt like teamwork. Later, it felt like leverage. I noticed how Linda would soften her voice when Evan needed help, how Gary would avoid eye contact when I asked questions that slowed things down. They were not cruel. That almost made it worse. They were polite while diminishing me. There is a specific kind of injustice in being treated well while being erased. You cannot point to it without sounding ungrateful. That is the trap. One night stands out clearly now. We were eating takeout in the kitchen. Evan was talking about a potential business idea. Linda leaned forward, interested. Gary asked questions. I waited. Eventually, I asked whether this would affect the rental property. Evan shrugged and said they would figure it out. Linda added gently that we did not need to complicate things. She looked at me and smiled. You always worry about details. That is your job. The room went quiet for a second. I felt something settle then. A realization that stayed with me. No one takes your power with force when you are an adult. They take it by excluding you from the moment choices are made. That was the lesson people in their 50s already know but rarely say out loud. Decisions shape outcomes long before consequences appear. By the time you are invited back into the room, the truth is already recorded. I started paying closer attention after that. Not to argue, to observe. I noticed how often Evan spoke for the family, how often Linda deferred to his comfort, how Gary justified everything as keeping the peace. I also noticed how often they relied on me to fix small problems, to read contracts, to explain terms, to organize files. They wanted my competence without my consent. That contradiction defined my place in the family. As the stakes grew, so did the dismissals. When I asked about long-term plans for the property, Linda said we would talk later. Later never came. When I mentioned reviewing paperwork together, Gary said there was no need to overthink it. Evan joked that I was always dramatic about paperwork. That one stung because it was said with a laugh, which meant I could not challenge it without becoming the problem. The escalation reached money in a way that could not be undone. Conversations that once included me were happening entirely elsewhere. I knew because details slipped, a number mentioned that had not been discussed, a timeline that was already set. Each clue pointed to the same conclusion. They had decided I did not need to be present. I did not confront them then. I did not warn them. I did not even change my tone. I did what invisible children learn to do best. I watched, and I remembered. Because if there is one thing years of being overlooked teaches you, it is that silence is not weakness. It is preparation. If you have ever heard the phrase "you are fine" used as a reason to push you aside, comment, "I am fine." The house in Frisco was never supposed to be a problem. That was how it was introduced to me years ago, not as a lifeline or a rescue plan, but as a family investment. A small duplex in a quiet neighborhood, nothing flashy, the kind of property people in Texas buy when they want steady rent and fewer surprises. Linda liked to call it something we could all be proud of. Gary talked about long-term value. Evan talked about potential. I listened and did the math. At the time, I was early in my career, living carefully, putting money aside instead of upgrading my car or traveling the way my friends did. When the conversation turned to the down payment, I offered to help. Not because I was pressured, but because it made sense. I had savings from bonuses and a year of saying no to things I wanted. I wired my portion and watched my name go onto the paperwork alongside theirs. Later, it was folded into a small LLC, for simplicity, the word they liked to use whenever complexity became inconvenient. It felt collaborative then. It felt adult. It felt like trust. For a while, it worked the way investments are supposed to. Rent came in, expenses went out. I kept copies of everything without thinking much about why. It was just a habit I had picked up from work. I take screenshots, I save emails, I keep versions. Not because I expect betrayal, but because I understand how easily details get rewritten later. Evan was loosely involved at first, mostly in conversation. He liked to talk about what could be done with the place. New paint, different tenants, maybe refinancing someday. When his own finances started to wobble, the tone changed. It was never announced directly. I noticed it in fragments. A credit card balance mentioned offhand. A personal loan he needed time on. A business venture that did not work out the way he had planned. No crimes, no scandals. Just the quiet accumulation of bad decisions that always seemed to find someone else willing to soften the landing. That someone was usually my parents. When Evan needed help, the explanation followed a familiar pattern. He is under a lot of pressure. He just needs stability. This house could give him that. The first time I heard it framed that way, it startled me. The house was no longer an investment. It was leverage. I asked what that meant for ownership. Gary waved a hand like the answer was obvious. We would figure it out. Linda stepped in with her practiced calm. Evan needs this more than you do. You have a good job. You are doing well. You will be fine. There it was again. Fine as a justification. Fine as an eraser. Conversations that used to include me shifted subtly. Meetings with the accountant happened when I could not attend. Updates came after decisions were made. When I asked questions, they sounded irritated, not because the questions were unreasonable, but because they interrupted a narrative they preferred. Evan started speaking about the property as if it were already his responsibility. He talked about tenants like they were his concern alone. When I pointed out that the LLC structure meant shared consent, Linda smiled and said paperwork can always be adjusted. It was said lightly, like a reassurance. That sentence stayed with me. Paperwork can always be adjusted. That is where people hide betrayal. Not in shouting matches or slammed doors, but in processes that sound neutral and final. Adjustments, updates, cleanups. The toxic escalation accelerated under the cover of reason. They framed every step as logical. Evan needed stability. I had stability. Evan was struggling. I was not. Therefore, resources should move toward Evan. No one said my contribution no longer mattered. They simply acted as if it were less relevant. When I mentioned that my name was on the LLC, Gary said it was just a formality. Linda added that we were family and did not need to get technical. Evan laughed and said I was always worried about paperwork. I did not laugh back. I knew exactly how paperwork works. I knew how easily forms are signed and filed when one person is absent. I knew how a record can change quietly if the timing is right. That was the first moment I felt a shift from frustration to something colder. Not anger, awareness. I began documenting more intentionally. I saved emails that mentioned decisions I had not been part of. I took screenshots of bank statements showing my initial contribution. I noted dates and names. I did not announce this. I did not accuse anyone. I simply prepared. Because if there is one lesson people in their 50s understand deeply, it is that systems reward those who arrive with records, not feelings. The language around the house became increasingly dismissive. When I suggested reviewing long-term plans together, Linda said we did not need to complicate things. When I asked whether refinancing would affect ownership percentages, Gary said that was getting ahead of ourselves. Evan joked that I was making everything sound like work. What he did not say out loud was that he needed flexibility, and flexibility often means removing obstacles. I was becoming an obstacle by asking to be included. Money has a way of clarifying roles. Once Evan needed the house to solve his problems, my role shifted from partner to inconvenience. The phrase that hurt the most was also the most polite. This is just a procedural thing, nothing personal. That is how people absolve themselves. Procedure feels neutral, it feels clean, but procedures decide who benefits and who is erased. I watched as the plan solidified without me. Conversations grew shorter, updates became summaries. I was being positioned as someone who would not object because objecting would disrupt the image of a supportive family. That was the point. They were counting on my silence. What they did not know was that silence does not mean ignorance. It means timing. I know how a file disappears from one folder and reappears in another. I know how consent is assumed when absence is convenient, and I always keep emails just in case. By the time the message arrived, Sedona looked exactly like the brochure's promise. The red rocks caught the late afternoon light in a way that made everything feel intentional, as if the landscape itself had been arranged to calm people down. We were seated on a patio restaurant overlooking the canyon, the kind of place my mother loves because it feels elevated without being pretentious. The table was full, glasses clinked. Evan was relaxed, leaning back in his chair, talking about timing and opportunity the way he always does when he wants to sound confident. My father nodded along, occasionally adding a practical comment about markets or trends. My mother smiled, refilled glasses, and asked the server about dessert. It was perfect in the way that perfection often is carefully maintained and oddly fragile. I remember thinking how quiet my phone had been all day. No work alerts, no emails, no reminders. That should have felt like relief. Instead, it felt staged. When the vibration finally came, it was subtle, just enough to register through the table. I glanced down, expecting something routine. Instead, I saw Marissa's name. No greeting, no softening language, just information. Signing at 9 a.m. tomorrow. I did not move. I read it again, slower. Texas time. Tomorrow morning. Before I could lock the screen, another message followed. Special power of attorney has been uploaded. That one landed heavier. My chest did not tighten. My hands did not shake. My thoughts simply aligned. A POA meant someone could sign on my behalf. A special one meant it was narrow, precise, designed for a single purpose. This was not an accident or a misunderstanding. It was a workaround. Then the third message appeared, the one that confirmed everything I had been circling for months. Once recorded undoing, it is expensive and ugly. That was Marissa being kind. Expensive meant legal fees and time. Ugly meant public disputes and fractured relationships. She was telling me what the process would look like if I let the clock run out. I looked up from my phone and scanned the table. No one was watching me. My mother was laughing at something Evan had said. My father was checking his watch. The server arrived with dessert menus. It struck me then how deliberately calm everything felt. They were relaxed because they believed the outcome was already decided. The timing was not a coincidence. They needed me here, out of state, distracted, smiling. I did not feel anger in that moment. I felt recognition, the kind that comes when a pattern finally completes itself. This was the escalation point, from being excluded from conversations to being excluded from consent. The POA explained everything. They were planning to sign without me. Not by forging my name, not by breaking the law outright, but by using a structure that allows people to act as if absence equals agreement. It is legal if done carefully. That is what makes it dangerous. I did not confront them. I did not ask questions. I did not leave the table. I stayed seated listening to Evan talk about future plans, knowing that one of those plans involved removing my name from something I had paid into. The internal shift was quiet. One sentence formed clearly in my mind and stayed there. I could see exactly why they needed me away. Control of time is control of truth. Whoever moves first gets to define what happened. They were betting that I would not move in time. That was the real threat. Not the paperwork itself, but the deadline attached to it. 9 a.m. A fixed point. I understood then that nothing I said at this table would matter. Conversations were irrelevant now. Only actions counted. This was not the moment for emotion. It was the moment for precision. I excused myself politely, saying I needed some air. My mother nodded without looking up. My father said nothing. Evan waved me off casually. Outside, the air was cooler. The canyon stretched out in front of me, indifferent and steady. I read the messages again, focusing on the details. Special power of attorney uploaded. That meant documents were already prepared. Someone had coordinated this in advance. Someone had decided that my consent was a hurdle to be managed rather than a requirement to be respected. I thought back to every time paperwork had been dismissed as a formality. This was what they meant. Formalities are only invisible until they are used against you. My phone buzzed again. Marissa did not add anything new. She did not need to. The message was complete, a countdown without a clock. I typed a brief response. Thank you for the heads up. That was all. I did not ask questions. I did not ask for advice. She knew what that meant. I stood there for a moment longer, listening to the muted sound of laughter from the patio. The contrast was sharp. Perfect trip. Perfect timing. Perfect distance. They had arranged all of it so that by the time I returned home, the record would already reflect their version of events. That was the point of doing it this way. Paper does not argue back. I went back to the table and finished dinner. I complimented the dessert. I smiled when my mother asked if I was enjoying myself. Evan raised a glass and made a casual toast to family time. I raised mine too. Inside, everything had gone still. This was the moment things stopped being ambiguous. The threat was no longer theoretical, it was scheduled. There are moments in adult life when you realize that waiting is the same as agreeing. This was one of them. If you think they would not dare do something like this, you will want to hear what happened next. I did not announce my exit. I did not make a scene. I waited for a natural pause in the conversation and said I had a headache and needed to lie down. It was delivered casually, the way women are trained to excuse themselves without disturbing the atmosphere. My mother nodded without looking up from her plate. She asked if I needed water, already reaching for her glass. Evan glanced at me and said, "Okay, the word landing flat, uninterested." My father told me to get some rest. No one followed. No one asked questions. That was confirmation enough. I went back to my room, closed the door, and moved quickly but quietly. I packed only what I needed, rolling clothes instead of folding them, keeping the lights low. My phone screen glowed in the dark as I searched for flights. The closest workable route was Phoenix to Dallas-Fort Worth, leaving just after midnight. Flagstaff would have worked too, but Phoenix had availability that put me on the ground before sunrise. I booked the ticket without hesitating. I did not check with anyone. I did not feel the need to explain. This was no longer about feelings. It was about timing. I sat on the edge of the bed for a moment, grounding myself, then made the first call. A civil attorney I knew through a colleague at work, someone who handled real estate disputes without theatrics. It went to voicemail. I left a concise message giving my name, the situation, and the deadline. 9 a.m. tomorrow, title office, potential improper use of power of attorney. I asked for an immediate callback. I did not add emotion. Lawyers do not respond to emotion. They respond to urgency and clarity. The second call was to the title office. Not Marissa this time, but the general line. I asked for the manager on duty and explained that there was a dispute regarding ownership consent and that I was requesting an immediate hold on recording until verification could be completed. I used the language I knew would be taken seriously. Disputed authority, questioned consent, pending review. The manager asked for documentation. I told her it was coming. That was enough to pause momentum. The third step was the longest. I opened my laptop and pulled up the folders I had quietly maintained for years. Email threads confirming my contribution, bank statements showing the wire transfer for the down payment, operating agreements from the LLC formation, messages where decisions were referenced after the fact. I compiled them into a single folder labeled clearly time-stamped ready to send. This was the paper trail, the part people underestimate until it is too late. While files uploaded and emails queued, I made the call my family did not know existed. An escrow manager I had worked with on a compliance issue months earlier. We were not close. We were professional. That was better. When he answered, his tone was immediate and respectful. I explained the situation in plain terms. He did not interrupt. He did not question my credibility. He asked for names, dates, and document references. When I gave them, he paused and said he would make some calls. That was the sound of leverage being acknowledged. I shut down the laptop and took a final look around the room. Everything looked undisturbed. I slipped out through the hallway, passing the closed door to my parents' room, then the faint sound of laughter drifting from the patio below. They thought I was resting. I checked out quietly and called a rideshare to the airport. The drive was dark and uneventful. Sedona faded behind me as the car merged onto the highway. I watched the clock the entire time, calculating margins. Minutes mattered now. At the airport, I moved efficiently. No small talk. No hesitation. I boarded with the calm focus that comes when your mind has accepted a single objective. Protect consent. Preserve record. The flight was quiet. I did not sleep. I reviewed documents on my phone, flagged messages, drafted emails to send the moment I landed. Somewhere over New Mexico, my phone buzzed. The attorney called back. He confirmed receipt of my voicemail and asked me to forward everything I had. I did mid-air using the spotty connection to send compressed files. He responded with a single line, "I will be there." That was enough. As the plane descended into Dallas-Fort Worth, the sky was just beginning to lighten. I felt steady, not relieved. This was not over. But the balance had shifted. The plan that depended on my absence was already cracking. When the wheels touched down, I turned my phone back on fully. Messages flooded in from the title office acknowledging the hold. The escrow manager confirmed coordination. Everything was moving the way it should when facts are introduced at the right moment. I walked through the terminal without stopping, collected my bag, and headed for the exit. Outside, the air was cool and familiar. Home, but not in the sentimental sense. Home, as in jurisdiction. Home, as in presence. I knew where I was going next. The office, the place where signatures were supposed to be completed without me. If you want to see what public humiliation looks like without anyone raising their voice, stay with me. The title office in Plano looked exactly like every other one I had ever been in. Beige walls, framed certificates, slightly crooked, the low hum of a printer, warming up somewhere behind the counter. There was a faint smell of burnt coffee mixed with paper and toner, the scent of ordinary transactions. Nothing dramatic ever happens in places like this, which is why people underestimate how much power sits inside them. When I walked in, my family was already seated in the small conference room off to the side. Evan sat closest to the table, jacket folded neatly over the chair like he belonged there. He was talking softly to my mother, his voice calm, reassuring. My father stood near the window, hands clasped behind his back posture, respectful, the image of someone who believed everything was proceeding properly. They looked composed, prepared, the kind of people who expect cooperation, not resistance. I did not announce myself. I stepped into the room as the notary was arranging documents, placing them into neat stacks, aligning pens. Evan looked up first. There was a flicker of surprise that vanished quickly, replaced by a practiced smile. He said my name like this was a coincidence. My mother turned next, her expression tightening just enough to reveal irritation before smoothing back into politeness. My father nodded, avoiding my eyes. No one asked why I was there. That told me everything. They had expected this moment to happen without me. The notary cleared her throat and asked if everyone was ready to proceed. Before anyone could answer, the door opened again. My attorney walked in, briefcase in hand, composed and efficient. He introduced himself and took a seat beside me without ceremony. That was the first shift. The room recalibrated. Evan glanced at my mother. My mother adjusted her posture. My father exhaled slowly. Marissa entered a moment later, carrying a folder thicker than the others. She did not smile. She did not need to. She acknowledged me with a nod, then addressed the room. She stated calmly that the file had been placed on hold pending verification of authority. The words landed with weight. Hold, verification, authority. Evan tried to speak, but Marissa continued, her tone neutral and firm. She explained that a special power of attorney had been uploaded, but that questions had been raised regarding consent and timing. She looked directly at the notary and then at my parents. There was no accusation in her voice, just clarity. Then she said the sentence that froze the room. Kala is on title. She must consent. No one argued. No one could. It was a statement of record, not opinion. Evan leaned back slightly, color draining from his face. My mother's hands tightened around her purse. My father stared at the table as if the answer might be written there. This was the exposure. Not loud, not emotional, just undeniable. They were being asked to acknowledge a truth they had tried to work around. In front of strangers, in front of professionals. The humiliation was procedural. The notary paused, pen hovering. She looked at me and asked if I wished to proceed. That was the moment, all eyes on me. I did not raise my voice. I did not explain my feelings. I said one sentence evenly, deliberately. You did not forget to ask me. You scheduled it for when I could not answer. Silence followed. It was the kind of silence that strips excuses bare. Evan opened his mouth, then closed it. My mother looked at me with something like disbelief, as if I had broken an unspoken agreement to stay quiet. My father shifted uncomfortably, the cost of keeping the peace suddenly visible. The attorney beside me slid a document across the table, outlining the ownership structure, the contributions, the consent requirements. Marissa confirmed the timeline of uploads and messages. The notary nodded, making notes. Each step reinforced the same conclusion. The plan depended on my absence. It failed because I arrived. No one accused anyone of wrongdoing out loud. That was not necessary. The facts did the work. Evan tried to regain control by reframing, talking about misunderstandings and timing issues. My attorney responded with dates and records. My mother appealed to family unity, suggesting we take this outside. The notary reminded her that the room was the appropriate place for resolution. My father finally spoke, asking if there was a way to move forward without conflict. My attorney answered that consent was the way forward, nothing else. The value of this moment was not in watching them struggle. It was in watching the system respond to evidence instead of emotion. People are not afraid of being discovered. They are afraid of being discovered in front of witnesses. This was that moment. The image they had carefully maintained cracked under fluorescent lights and the quiet attention of professionals who had no stake in preserving it. When the meeting concluded, the documents remained unsigned. The hold remained in place. The notary gathered her papers. Marissa closed her folder. My attorney stood and thanked everyone politely. My family stayed seated, stunned by the sudden reversal. I rose last. As I did, Evan finally looked directly at me. There was no anger in his eyes, only shock. The realization that the rules had changed, and he had not noticed until it was too late. Before leaving, I paused at the door. Not for them, but for myself. This was the line where silence ended. Would you have stayed or walked out? Comment stay or leave. The aftermath was quieter than the confrontation, which somehow made it heavier. The file did not move forward. That was the first consequence. The title office flagged the record and initiated a review that froze everything connected to the property. No sale, no transfer, no quiet correction later. The duplex in Frisco became what it should have been from the beginning, a shared asset that required shared consent. Evan did not get rescued by paperwork. He did not get to frame the delay as a misunderstanding. The hold meant scrutiny, and scrutiny has a way of revealing patterns people hoped would stay buried. Within days, the tone of communication shifted. Emails that once sounded confident became cautious. Calls went unanswered longer than usual. My parents stopped sending casual updates. They were embarrassed not because they had been caught doing something wrong in the legal sense, but because they had been exposed doing something calculated in front of people whose respect mattered to them. That kind of loss is harder to explain away. At church gatherings and neighborhood events, they avoided conversations about real estate. At the title office, they were no longer treated as cooperative clients, but as parties to a disputed file. The staff was polite, professional, distant. That distance was new. Evan felt it the most. Without the house as leverage, his options narrowed quickly. Creditors do not wait for family harmony. A few weeks passed before he reached out. He suggested coffee, casual, like nothing had changed. We met at a small place near a strip mall, the kind with plastic chairs and no music. He arrived early and stood when he saw me trying to project seriousness. He did not waste time on apologies. He never does. He asked if I could help him stabilize things just temporarily. Just co-sign. Just give me a little time. His voice was calm, measured, almost reasonable. That was his strategy. Make it sound small. Make it sound like a favor, not a pattern. I listened without interrupting. I noticed the way he avoided specifics. I noticed the way he framed his situation as unlucky rather than self-made. When he finished, I answered quietly. I am not financing the consequences of choices you keep repeating. I did not raise my voice. I did not explain further. He stared at me like he had not considered that this was an option. Later that evening, my phone rang. My mother. Her voice was tight, controlled. She said, "Family is family," and accused me of being harsh. She said I had embarrassed them and made things difficult for everyone. My father followed with a message about forgiveness and moving forward. Neither of them mentioned consent. Neither of them acknowledged the plan they had set in motion. They wanted resolution without accountability. I told them the same thing I told Evan, adjusted only slightly. I am not responsible for fixing what I was excluded from deciding. That was the boundary. The consequences unfolded steadily after that. Evan sold his car to cover part of his debt. He negotiated with lenders instead of leaning on family assets. It was uncomfortable. It was necessary. My parents had to sit with the reality that they could not smooth everything over anymore. They had chosen sides quietly for years, and now there was no quiet left. The space between us grew, but it was honest space. In the quiet moments, I reflected on how often people are taught to prioritize harmony over truth, especially in families. Many in their 50s grew up believing that keeping the peace mattered more than naming the problem. But peace built on omission is not peace. It is delay. And delay always collects interest. What happened in that office forced a reckoning that could not be postponed. I did not feel victorious. I felt clear. The invisible child had stopped absorbing consequences that were never hers to begin with. The quiet that followed did not feel empty. It felt earned. Once the review concluded and the immediate risk passed, I moved carefully and deliberately to separate what had been blurred for too long. With my attorney and the title office, I restructured my ownership interest in a way that was clean and final, My portion was documented clearly, my consent requirements formalized, and then I stepped away from what had been labeled a family investment. I did not argue about percentages or revisit old conversations. I chose clarity over history. The duplex in Frisco no longer represented unity or obligation. It became what it should have been from the start, an asset governed by rules, not assumptions. Stepping back was not retreat, it was repositioning. That distinction mattered. People assume that walking away means losing. Sometimes it means you finally stop carrying weight that was never yours. The part of my life my family never fully understood was that I was not relying on that property to survive. I had never said it out loud because I did not need to. Over the years through my work, I had built something quieter and more resilient. I was a minor partner in an LLC connected to my professional field, not flashy, not public, but structured carefully. It was the kind of stake that does not attract attention but carries veto power. I also kept a reserve fund that gave me flexibility when others panicked. Not wealth in the dramatic sense, but stability in the real one. Enough to make decisions based on principle instead of fear. That was the secret. I did not fight because I needed the house. I fought because consent matters. No one gets to take what you contributed just because they are used to you staying silent. My network mattered too. The calls I made were returned quickly because I had earned respect over time by being precise and reliable. Titles changed, positions shifted, but credibility stayed. That is the kind of power that does not announce itself. It just works. Looking back, I realize I never wanted revenge. I wanted alignment. When that proved impossible, I chose boundaries. I did not cut my family off dramatically. I simply changed where I stood. Conversations became shorter, expectations reset. I was no longer the default solution or the quiet backup plan. I was the person who asked to be included or declined to participate. The invisible child had become the one who set terms. That shift was the real ending. Peace arrived slowly, not as reconciliation, but as relief. I stopped bracing for messages that carried hidden consequences. I stopped replaying conversations in my head. The energy I had spent managing other people's outcomes returned to me. If you are learning how to say no without guilt, leave a dove. You are not selfish. You are just growing into yourself.